Over 80% of us believe homelessness is the number one problem we face as a community. Yet, if you're living on the street, you have very few tools to navigate your way out. And to those outside that world, we don't understand why the homeless population is larger than ever and where to begin to solve it. I'm Gavin Cooley, former CFO for the City of Spokane. Welcome to Housing and Help, a homeless solutions podcast. I'm meeting my friend Ed Byrnes, a professor of social work at Eastern Washington University. He's consulted for numerous state and local mental health centers, courts, schools, and law enforcement and corrections agencies throughout the western United States, including the Department of Justice. Ed uses data to study the social patterns and decisions we've made as a region over many decades and how that may have contributed to our homeless population.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was thinking about is you didn't grow up here.
No,
You grew up in the Bronx.
Yeah,
A little different place.
Yes.
Yes.
I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up on a housing project, Mobile Home Projects. And
So when we hear about the projects, if you grew up in Spokane, like were these the projects or?
yeah, they were like the apartment buildings were 15 stories
Right.
high, and there were 9 of them in the project I lived in. Then the surrounding neighborhood was just apartment buildings, and so that's where I lived. The thing I remembered most about being there is there's a lot of different kind of people. So I'm really glad that I grew up there actually, because I learned first off there's a lot of different kind of people, different groups of people. But even within groups, there's different groups of people, and I think that kind of relates to our topic. I think people look at folks who are unhoused and kind of make a big broad brush of like, oh, this is why they're there, and it's way more complicated.
Right. In your world, where the melting pot,
Right.
you couldn't really make those sweeping generalizations about anybody. I mean, it came from all directions.
Yeah, so I feel kind of lucky maybe that I was taught by life early on that hey, you can't do that.
Right.
I guess the other thing is, so I'm a professor at Eastern, and people might look and say, oh, you're this self-made person, but to be honest, I got some really fortunate breaks. And I know that's not the reason we're talking today is about what breaks did Ed Byrnes get. Okay. But I always keep that in mind, that when I look at anybody, I always realize, like, hey, they're before the grace.
Yeah. This could happen depending on circumstance to any one of us.
Yeah. So that's why I'm feeling pretty humble.
So when you came here, at some point, you met your wife, who actually grew up around here.
Yeah, my wife. In fact, we used to come to this place all the time. They don't have parades. So
well, we have that in common.
there we go.
Right.
So Janet grew up here. Mm-hmm. And when she was growing up here, the Kaiser aluminum fabrication plant was still going on, and they had round-the-clock shifts. And if you ever go up there and look at their parking lot, there's like 400 parking spots. There were a lot. I remember looking at that parking lot, and it's all grown over with weeds, and I just tried to picture it full of, I don't know, Chevelles and Mustangs and things, but people in there working around the clock.
Right.
So, but this neighborhood has gone through a lot of changes, and back when she was going to Rogers High, somebody could graduate from Rogers, go work for Kaiser, and could afford a car, could afford a little house, could afford to have a family, pay for their kids to go maybe up to Camp Reed or something like that. Everything was in reach for people, and I like to think there was a lot of dignity in work still because you were able to live in a way that was rewarding.
So we would all gather out at Liberty Lake on the weekends, and my recollection that a lot of those folks, the family friends, worked at Kaiser, drove trucks, delivered beer, whatever it was, and they all had good lives. And and in my own mind, I remember one of the guys was a stockbroker.
Right.
None of it made any, it was just one big group of people enjoying things together, and they all had lifestyles that, as kids, we all just kind of had this landscape that was fairly even.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like that anymore.
Yeah, well, and it was kind of a creeping thing when I think back on it, but people definitely are a bit more divisive, or divided.
Does that happen when a Kaiser disappears? I mean, what happens when something as big as Kaiser goes away? Because you've worked with this sort of thing.
Yeah, so and there's a guy named William Julius Wilson. He's a sociologist who's written a lot about when work disappears. In fact, the title of one of his books.
Oh, wow.
But what happened, was when Kaiser pulled out, like we were talking about earlier, it affected this neighborhood and hit it pretty hard, but it affected this whole city.
Oh, it did. I remember.
And made things harder for people in this whole city. And what happens then is, so a lot of people lost their homes. People couldn't afford to keep what they had been earning for themselves. People sort of moving away, doing other things. It makes the neighborhood a bit more disorganized, and makes it then what Wilson calls informal social controls. If you had a bunch of people and it was a pretty stable neighborhood, everybody knew each other, took a little more of a collective view that, when I was growing up in the projects, my neighbors could redirect me and tell me, hey, don't do that or do this, or they'd call my parents, whatever. But there
almost like an informal safety net.
Exactly.
And we were all, as kids, we didn't even know it. But
No.
we were being taken care of not just by our parents, but all those around us. And there was this cohesive community around us that we weren't even aware of. But using the current example, when something like Kaiser goes away, that disappears, and I don't even think any of us even realized what a big disappearance that was, because it hasn't come back.
Right. Well, the kind of employment we have now, it's not the same kind of thing. A lot of folks work kind of gig jobs, or they work jobs that they don't pay as well. I mean, you might look and say, oh, well, people are making $56,000 a year now, and that's higher than the median was in the 70s.
Right.
But when you adjust for it, well, you're an economist. When you adjust for inflation and everything, the value of that dollar isn't what it once was.
Well, I even look at the house my folks bought back in the early 60s, and it was about $13,000, and it was on the lower South Hill, and I'm guessing, somewhere in that neighborhood, likewise up here in the Hilliard neighborhood. But say you bought a house for $10,000 back in the 60s, if you adjusted that for inflation, it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of the 130,000, say, maybe 120,000. But we know that the homes in Hilliard are now going for 250, 300.
Right.
And so that's almost 3 times what you would expect with inflation. So suddenly the people, just the normal composition of the neighborhood has been disrupted, not just by the departure of Kaiser and other manufacturing jobs. It seems like it is also being affected by these housing values, which for some of us is a big win. For a lot of people, it's a barrier, isn't it?
You're exactly right. It's a barrier. The world is different than back when we had manufacturing jobs. Figure I read was that since 1970, about 40% of the manufacturing jobs have left this town.
Wow. What a disruption.
Yeah, big disruption.
So you move, you do all these different things in response to losing that main wage earner, and likely, if you lose that job at Kaiser, you don't move somewhere else nearby and find another Kaiser job.
Right. No, they were the big deal here. So you'd have to go somewhere else. And but we're talking about the housing cost, because that's one of the big. There's kind of 2 broad categories of factors I think about when I think about people being unhoused, about homelessness.
Yeah.
There's the kind of the opaque contributors to homelessness. By opaque, meaning they're just not that obvious.
Right. I mean, we see the obvious.
And then there's the apparent ones. The obvious ones.
Right.
So since we're talking about kind of housing costs, and I'm going to start, if you don't mind, sharing a couple thoughts I have about those kind of more opaque or less obvious contributors. So
because we all kind of know the obvious ones.
Right.
Is what you're saying, but there's these ones that unless we're studying this area, we don't know them.
Right, and I promise I will come back to the more obvious ones because part of our conversation is how did we get here.
Yeah, right.
So if we think about housing, wages just don't carry the value that they once have, but also if we just look at housing costs, and then I'll talk about kind of public responses that we have not had rather than had.
Right.
Okay. So we know that the cost of a house in Spokane has gone up by like 50% in just the last 2 years.
A couple of years, Up near 400,000, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just under 400,000.
Yeah.
And if we unpack that even just a little bit, for someone to come up with even 10%, ideally first-time homebuyers need to come up with about 20%.
FHA or VA go 10%.
Right, but if they can't do that, then they've got to.
You need 40,000.
Yeah.
Or if you're a second-time home buyer, you're going to need 80.
Right.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah. And some first-time home buyers might make too much to qualify for some mortgage support, so they're going to have to come up with 80.
They're no man's land. They make too much, but not enough to do that.
Right. So that takes a lot of saving.
Right.
So how do people save? Rents have gone up. Like, the rents have almost doubled in the past couple of years also.
I mean, you're just working off the value of the homes. I mean, as the homes go up, the rents go up.
Exactly.
And an incredibly low vacancy rate.
Right. And
I'm just thinking, just related to that, there are subsidies, but
Right.
it's like a 2-year waiting list.
three.
3.
Average waiting list.
You got young kids, you can't afford a house, trying to get into an apartment, can't afford it
Right.
because it's gone up just like the housing, and you got a 3-year wait to have any kind of subsidy.
Right, but even if they could get into an apartment, the idea that they're ever going to get out of an apartment, the chances are very, very slim
Right.
in the current environment. So, the price of rent, the price of purchasing a home, has made a lot of things out of reach for people.
And just pausing there too, Ed, because we were talking about back in the 60s or 70s, most of those homes we were talking about were one wage earner.
Yeah, exactly.
So now everything is based on 2 wage earners.
Yes,
But a lot of the people we're talking about now, they're struggling to get a home or get into a rental situation,
Right.
are single.
Yeah, it's
So
a
you
single-
cut it in half.
Yeah.
It doubles the effect of all the things we're talking about.
Right. Or if you have a couple together with a family,
Right.
usually both of them have to work. So what
You
they
get a whole
would
other set of problems.
what they would be able to save is getting gobbled up by childcare.
And it's interesting as we talk about those times, and everything seems so gradual. I mean, we talk about
Right.
some big bang moments like Kaiser,
Right.
but in many ways it was just kind of this gradual shift. But nobody sitting here today can say this is like, the question is, how did we get to this place?
Yeah.
I think we're all almost stunned that we're seeing all these homeless people
Right.
struggling, and it's not just in Spokane, it's all across the country.
Right.
And so you have this remarkable shift, and also I tracked a lot of indicators at the city
Right.
in my job, and all those most of the indicators we tracked, probably somewhere around 2010, began to rise
Right.
vertically. I mean, median household income went way up. The home values went up. Employment went way up. We had way more professional jobs. The sectors that we were real heavy in, like healthcare,
Right.
got, and so unemployment down. And even home values going up, depending on how you're looking at it, is an
Right.
indicator, a positive indicator.
Right.
The population growth rate, which indicates the viability and the desirability of a community, is almost double historical norms.
Right.
So that's a great indicator. People coming from the outside, Spokane's discovered. They're landing on all kinds of lists for, greatest, mid-sized community to live in.
Right.
So you look at all those, and if you ask somebody, because it's probably the best it's been since before Expo. So we're going back
Oh,
60
yeah.
years.
Yeah,
before
and for the 20
1974.
years I've been here, this is the biggest boom I've seen.
Yeah, it's a boom.
Yeah.
But for so many people, and as we look and we ask that question, how did we get here with this homelessness situation? It's
Right.
the opposite of a boom.
Right.
So if you ask somebody, with all those indicators, you're looking at all these positive indicators, really positive indicators, and you say, what do you suppose our number one problem is in Spokane right now? And I think most people would agree it is. Guess what it is? And if you ask somebody that, I think the last thing they would come up with is homelessness.
Right.
And yet it is it's a really big problem, isn't
It's
it?
a really big problem. And
So how did we get here?
well, I talked a bit about housing prices and people being priced out. We talked a bit about just folks not being able to save enough money. Something to remember about indicators is, when we think about like a median family income,
Yeah.
we have to remember median is the 50% point, so half the population is making less than that.
Right.
So what I'm going to suggest is we have a boom, yes, but it's a boom that's left a lot of people behind. And that's why we're having this homelessness problem, because if there's not places to rent, or if people can't afford it, they don't have another choice.
Right.
I've talked with people I've seen who are unhoused, try to help them out, give them $10 or something to get something to eat, and they're working and like living in their cars.
Right.
So this is a complicated problem. There's not
It
a
gets into
single
the
factor.
opaqueness of it, because
Yeah.
our vision of what it is somebody who won't work, for instance. You just mentioned
Right.
work.
Right.
But you're saying that's not the case
No.
frequently.
No, it isn't. And
Yeah.
so there's a couple of kind of policy events that occurred that really kind of set the stage for this to happen. It took a while for them to unfold. But so in order to subsidize housing, cities need to have revenue. Right? And we used to be able to get revenue through a thing called revenue sharing. It was a federal policy. It started in 1972. And it was ended in 1986. And it's where the federal government, part of the rationale was let's give the cities just some unencumbered money so they can tackle the problems that are facing them. And over the 14 years of that program, almost $5 billion was returned to municipalities. And for a smaller city, now Spokane is kind of a mid-sized city, but for smaller cities, oftentimes that was like their only source of unencumbered funds.
Yeah.
But the revenue sharing, getting that cut out, made it really hard for a lot of municipalities, a lot of cities, to create subsidized housing or to maintain subsidized housing. Other things that happen is there used to be things like community action programs, model cities, urban renewal, and those programs were around in the 70s, and by the early 80s, those were cut out. They no longer existed. And so a lot of the I keep saying federal flow through, but
Right.
In a city like Spokane, where we pretty much depend on sales tax,
Right.
those federal dollars mean a lot.
Sales and property tax are the top two,
Right.
and it depends on the given year, but they're really close. But property tax itself, initiative 747 back in I think 2003 limited it to a 1% increase per year.
Right. I remember.
That's not
that.
keeping up with the problem.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
So there were those kind of revenue sources. Also, pretty consistently, the funding for Section 8 subsidized housing kept getting decreased. That started in the 1970s.
So even as you have a greater need because the housing costs are going up
Right.
almost vertically,
Right.
your allowances for lower cost housing and the programs to support that are going the other direction.
Exactly. And another thing that happened in the 1980s was there used to be supports like some of the model city supports, things like that, where the formula was based on like an expenditure reimbursement, and I'll come back to that when I talk about obvious factors. But pretty much in the 80s, everything in the federal government went to block grants, where you would get a fixed amount of dollars, and they would be earmarked for a specific purpose, and do the best you can with them was pretty much what municipalities were told.
The city would get the
Yeah, the city. So a different city would get a fixed amount of dollars. And that was independent of whether a bunch of people moved in that year or, so they had to pretty much make do with what they have.
Right.
So those are a couple of factors around that are kind of a little less obvious, a little more opaque. The other thing is, why aren't people a little more up in arms about housing costs? Well, folks that are already in, people that already own homes, kind of like seeing the value of their homes increase. The other thing is a lot of folks mistakenly believe that the value of their home is like going to help them with their retirement. So that's not a very accurate assumption, because if they sell their home to recoup that equity, they still have to live somewhere.
Right.
I don't
If
think
you're going to really
people
downsize your lifestyle, you're going to have to think about that.
Exactly. So I think they think, oh, great, I've increased in value $200,000, but they're still going to have to live somewhere.
But so
They
you're
don't
saying, but
think of
even
it.
as arguably, if there is that benefit of the value increase, it's
Right.
for the current homeowners.
Right.
And if you're not a current homeowner,
No, then you're
you're
kinda
locked out.
You're locked out.
increasingly locked out. Every year it goes like this, it gets worse.
Right. But there's a reluctance to do much about the problem, because there's a group of folks that believe they have a vested interest in the way things are going right now.
Right. I mean, more and more, it's just a separation, but
Right.
for a large group of the population, things are going pretty darn well, but at the margins,
Right.
it's just the opposite. And
Right.
it's almost like the better we do on the housing values and the people moving into our community, a lot of the jobs that are showing up are at the higher level,
Exactly.
Four-year
Exactly.
master's degree, whatever.
Right.
That's not working for people at the margins at all. So that
Right.
crowd we enjoyed so much, that I enjoyed out at Liberty Lake back in the day, that had these workaday jobs where they worked hard, they earned an honest living,
Right.
and had a good life.
Yeah.
It's like it doesn't exist.
Well, yeah, given the way wages have not nearly kept up with inflation, and I'm not talking about this latest inflation cycle, I'm talking about over
Right.
decades.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Those same folks, you wouldn't see them at Liberty Lake because they'd be working their second job. So just another thing I just want to have us think about is that people wonder, well, why would folks think that their home value is so important for their retirement? And that's because, back in the 80s, a lot of the private sector got out of the pension business.
Right.
You know, municipal governments, state governments, they tend to have pensions still.
I think it's something like 6% of the population has what we used to think of as a pension.
Right.
And just to point out, because a lot of people have them, but your IRA or your 401k is something you've set aside, maybe with a small match or some level of match from the company, but it's not at all the same as the old style pensions.
No, it's not like a guaranteed or a defined benefit. Is what where they say you've worked for this company with this one, you get this much.
You can retire and basically have your same lifestyle.
Right. So what's happened is the reason people get so locked into thinking, oh, my home value, is there's about a third of the people who are kind of our age, at retirement age. There's still a third of those people have no savings.
Right.
No savings. And then when you look at families across the board, the median household retirement saving is only $65,000. That's not going to get you a year.
Be lucky to get through a rough year with that.
Yeah, exactly. So so people understand that they don't have a lot for retirement, so they kind of cling on to this home value, and that's why there's a lot of resistance to changing zoning laws, to freeing up some space for infill.
So when we look at all these things that are going on and how they really directly impact families, like when we talk about the families in Hilliard that suddenly they don't have a job at Kaiser and they can't find a job, anything like that any longer.
Oh, yeah, their wages are half. Yeah.
It's not hard to imagine what happens. You know, whatever home equity they had, they probably had to move out of their house, go somewhere else. You survive on that home equity for a while, and then pretty soon you're bouncing around, you're renting, but that kind of just gets us into a cycle then that, where you're moving, you're displaced. We know how people respond under stress, but it creates a real psychological impact on the whole family.
Absolutely.
And that's something you've worked with families, you've worked with young people a lot in counseling,
and if people are treated as if they're disposable, they are not going to value themselves as much over time if they keep getting that message. You know, a lot of the kids I worked with, society kind of wanted to push them away.
So, Ed, you're a professor of social work at Eastern Washington University, so you're well acquainted with the programs and the funding sources and how that works. Has that changed over time?
Dramatically. So I know I touched on the more individual psychological effects, but I want to shift a bit to the policy level because there were two policies that collided with each other in a really bad way back in the 1980s. So one of the things that was very well intentioned was this idea of we need to care for people using the least restrictive alternatives. And that would make sense. I think any one of us would say encouraging people to have as much independence, as much liberty as they can possibly have is a good thing. That's rooted in our values as our cultural values as a country. So under that idea, we began to really move people out of state institutions, like Eastern State Hospital would be an example, or Western State Hospital. We started moving people out of there with the best of
these are people
of
that you're talking about that are struggling or have
these
mental health conditions.
Right. These are folks that have very severe mental health conditions. Try to imagine walking through life with a narrator telling you all the bad stuff that you're doing, or making up bad stuff that you do, and telling you, you're a failure, you're no good, or you're a creep, you're a slob. Because a lot of folks I worked with, when they have auditory hallucinations, they usually don't have very encouraging ones. Okay, they're usually pretty negative ones. So these are folks that have that kind of, or you have people that like really biologically don't have good control over their moods. Okay. So these folks were released from these institutions. Really not released; they were like shoved out.
So which is a new phenomenon. There's this population of people struggling, just like today, with these mental health issues.
Right, and this started in the 1980s. And from what I know of, we talk to anybody that works in the public mental health system, getting somebody into long-term inpatient psychiatric care is very, very difficult. Okay, there's not a lot of beds, and in fact, we have something that's kind of at cross purposes where if so Spokane County has its own allotment of psychiatric beds at the state hospital, and there's different groups of counties with lower populations, but if they exceed that, they're actually penalized. Like their mental health funds, they have to pay out extra.
So they're really back to that least restrictive alternative. Pretty soon, people that and go back 40 years or something, would have had some really close care to help them kind of
Right.
navigate through life. You're saying there were some significant policy changes that literally
Right,
put
so
these
one-
people out on the streets.
So one was deinstitutionalized, and the other thing that really made a problem was that we shifted. Okay, so mental health funding up until the mid-1980s was through Title 19, Social Security Act, and that was a cost reimbursement formula that whatever different public community mental health centers spent to care for the impoverished population, for people who are Medicaid or Medicaid participants or Medicaid eligible, they would get reimbursed back for that. In the 1980s, they switched that to a block grant.
Set them out.
Yeah, just a set amount, and those were under the Human Services Block Grant Program, and it has stayed that way since then. Okay.
So as all these changes occurred and you didn't have these services available any longer,
Right. So you can
what
imagine the
stepped in
collision.
to replace it?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Well, the goodness of charitable organizations, but that's not enough. Okay.
Right.
And the charitable organizations do phenomenal work, and their staff give completely of themselves, but it's not sufficient. So you can see the policy collision there,
Right.
deinstitutionalizing while defunding.
Well, suddenly it's incumbent on the community with these limited block grant funds to somehow address something that had been being addressed on the federal level.
Yeah.
And the cities, of course, you're talking about a time frame in which the cities themselves were struggling just to balance their ordinary budgets.
And they
for
had
streets,
Yeah.
people in this town know we've struggled to pay for keeping our streets.
Right, and
police,
they
library,
had
parks,
lost
fire.
revenue sharing on top of it, so they didn't have any discretionary funds.
No, they're drowning in their own problems, and now they've got this new issue. To be honest with you, because I was there in 2003 through the last 20 years or so,
Yeah.
I don't even think we were very aware that was a responsibility that had landed in our corner and that we
Right.
should be responding to somehow.
Right. Well, that wasn't clearly communicated by the feds. The other thing that happened is at the federal level, the Department of Veterans Affairs, but back in the old days, it was called the Veterans Administration.
Right.
In 1982, they decided, the Office of Management and Budget in Washington, D.C., decided that they didn't really need a line item for inpatient substance abuse treatment for veterans.
Right about the time it was getting really bad. Really?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
some about when that was occurring?
1982.
Wow.
They said, look, we're going to defund these. It took them a couple of years to completely
So
dismantle
the drug problems
that.
we know were going like this, and the types of drugs and the addiction to those types of drugs is going up.
Right, and it's
and
not like
funding
it's
is
not
going
like
up.
we weren't getting in more conflicts or creating more veterans. It's so that was another contributing factor. So those are some of the obvious factors.
Which, and we all kind of wonder about, because we know that homelessness among the veteran population is a real problem.
Right, and the VA is doing more about that.
They've really, in
but,
recent years, that's
you
been
know,
the
they're-
one area that
Yeah.
communities have focused on.
Yeah, they've done a
And,
great job with the veterans outreach, and
Right.
they're really doing their level best. But that intensive inpatient kind of care on the substance abuse side was cut out. So,
Wow. Because we all know substance abuse
all right.
is a problem. It's part of this problem. We know
Right.
that intuitively, but we're
Right.
kind of thinking, is it just that the drugs have gotten so much worse, the opioids and whatnot? But no, there's a policy element to this also.
Yeah, it's just that the policy element and the availability of the substances have collided with it. A lot of
It's like a perfect storm.
I'm using the word collide a lot because how we got here is a string of policy collisions.
Right?
And so now we're at a situation because of that human services block granting also funds substance abuse services. People who need inpatient substance abuse services have months and months of wait list.
And your addiction issues don't stand over here. You can't set those aside waiting to get the treatment you need.
Right. Like I remember talking with the woman who ran the needle exchange program, and she said sometimes someone would come into the van, and finally they're ready. And it was heartbreaking to say, well, let's get you on a list, Let's get you on a list.
Wow.
So we've got these policy collisions. And what I hope, I wish it was, honestly, I wish there was a simple answer. I'm a social scientist, I'm a statistician.
I was going to say, you're also a statistician, so from
we're-
that perspective, it isn't Because I think, boy, do we want. I'm going to ask you later what you think about whether homelessness is solvable in our community, but we want to think that there's kind of the silver bullet. You know, that if we just do this,
there isn't one.
There isn't.
There's
not
one.
two even.
Because there's a number of factors that go into this. But probably the most important thing I hope people take away is when you see someone who's living on the street, understand that there could be any number of reasons they're there.
Right.
You know, you could see somebody holding a sign. They could be someone that's also working a night shift and has their kids sleeping in a car.
So as I'm driving down the street and I see some guy standing there asking for money, and he looks healthy, she looks healthy, and I think to myself, you know, I had to get a job. I have to go to work every day.
Yeah, but maybe,
why don't you? But that's not.
Maybe he doesn't have $1,600 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment.
Yeah. And
for his kids, right?
And there's so many things we take for granted. You know, when you start thinking this through, because now we're talking about it, is, you know, how do you get ready for work in the morning? Well, you take a shower. You know?
Right.
You eat some healthy food so you don't, you know, bomb out 2 hours later with no energy and all these things. You know, you come in looking presentable.
Right.
Yeah. How do you do any of those things when you're in a homeless situation?
Exactly.
And how do you? I mean, I got to think once you're in that situation, getting out of it has got to be again, there's no silver bullet. It's probably going to take a lot of things to get them out, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things we have to really pay attention to is try to get at what's the fundamental problem. If someone's unhoused, the fundamental problem is that they're unhoused.
Right.
Then we can get at the other factors.
Is this problem solvable? And I want to ask it in the context of Spokane, because, you know, when you listen to the problems in LA or Seattle or Portland, it almost sounds overwhelming, you know, and I think they've got a real, it's not just the problem they have right now, but it's growing all the time. But we're hearing statistics that say things like, you know, the vast majority, despite, you know, stories to the otherwise, of homeless in Spokane are from Spokane. You know, this is our own population we're dealing with. There's very few people from, you know, that are just coming to Spokane because, gee, they have nice, warm winters or something.
Right, exactly.
I'm going to go be homeless over there. So we're dealing with our own situation, but also Spokane has this amazing ability. You and I were talking about it in the context of this, you know, this room right now, to survive and to handle difficult situations.
Right.
With all that said, do you think Spokane can solve its homeless problem?
I think we have a better opportunity right now than if we ignore it. Because right now, I know it seems so big to people walking around town, but it's still at a scale where we could hopefully have some policy impacts. Okay. And it's multifaceted because people are not homeless for one reason. So we're gonna have to really pull together a lot of different providers and a lot of different resources.
So we can do that, right?
Yeah. Well, I would tell you, like, my definition of collaboration isn't that we talk. It's that people come, put resources on the table with an understanding that they're not completely in charge of what happens to the resources.
Yeah.
That is sharing resources. That's one of the things we have to do.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to just pause there because it sounds like, overwhelming from a financial perspective. How do we pay for all this?
Ignore it for 5 years and see how overwhelming it is.
But I look at it even in the current situation, because I know as the CFO of the city for the last 18 years that the policing costs, the criminal justice costs, the court costs, the probation costs, the public defender, the prosecutor, the healthcare system, the frequent flyers in the emergency room.
Right.
I mean, when you add all those costs up, I'm hearing estimates between $100,000 and $200,000 minimum per person that are being expended just at the status quo level, which, by the way, isn't helping the homeless. They're in a desperate situation.
And it's not helping any of us.
And it's not helping our community. It's tearing our fabric of our community apart. But the resources are there, and I've seen a lot of success at the city, when the city, in the first place, the city and the county come together, because it's kind of a county. The structure, the statutory structure is the county gets much of the dollars that would be associated with addressing many of these problems. But it's not a county problem. It's mostly centered in the city. So the city and the county have to come together to pool resources.
Right.
And that includes all the services they offer. I mean, the sheriff's office, the police department, you know, they're separate, but they need to be working closely. And then you pull the healthcare system into the room, and you talk to them about, well, what if we can work with you to lower the costs that you're bearing with the homelessness right now, the ER rooms, the staffing that you're doing to really triage this situation. We like to spend some of those triage dollars addressing the situation. We start to move triage dollars, Band-Aids, into permanent solutions.
Right, because if you have a more stable, permanent solution, your need for triage is going to go way down.
Way down.
And I'm really glad that, you know, you talked about the marginal cost, because I hope that anybody that's watching us have this conversation understands. If someone is wondering why their health insurance premiums are going up, it's because there's this inordinate amount of pressure on the hospitals.
So doing nothing isn't free.
Right, and it's not the fault of the person going to the hospital. It's the structural issue of how things are being done. Right. That if someone's wondering, like, hey, my car was broken into, how come the police aren't coming out to take a look? They're just giving me a case number. It's because they're overrun dealing with triaging these other problems. So I hope when people see this that they understand, when you think about these marginal costs, that this affects all of us, whether we think it does or not. Somebody could go, like I live out in the valley, somebody could never leave the valley ever in their whole life, and on purpose say, I'm never going to go downtown.
Right.
It's still affecting them.
Right.
Okay. So I'm glad you talked about margins.
Ed, when I think about the overwhelming feeling we get when we think about the cost of dealing with the homeless situation, I think what gets missed is that doing nothing, you know, just staying right where we are, is incredibly expensive. Because all the services we're providing right now, if you talk to the fire department personnel, you know, every day, a huge number of their calls, we think of the fire department, only about 7 or 8% of their calls are related to fires. Right. You know, it's mostly medical response. And a huge amount of that is going to the homeless population. When you think about the ERs and the hospitals, they're having to deal with that all the time, where, you know, these medical situations that really should be being dealt with on a permanent basis are being dealt with at the ER rooms over and over and over again. So you got the fire department taking people to the ER to deal with situations that shouldn't be dealt with that way. And so, and you start to add that up, the criminal justice system, of course. I mean, you know, a night in jail is about 130, 140 bucks a night. Right. You know, and then you've got the costs of the courts and the probation and the public defender. Estimates vary, but it's somewhere between $100,000 per individual and $200,000 per individual that's being expended right now by all these different parts of the community. And so when we think about that, we think, wow, is there a way to capture all those dollars that are just going to triage, not creating any kind of permanent solution, not moving people towards the exits of homelessness and creating a better life for them, creating a better fabric in our community? The triage dollars aren't going there. Imagine what we could do with $100,000 or $200,000 a year per individual if we could direct that towards permanent solutions.
You could build a lot of affordable housing with that.
Affordable housing, the support systems you're talking about, the therapeutic resources that they need. I mean, as you said, it's complicated, but we could afford it.
And you know, our mental health system has the knowledge. What they need is a lot more of the staff. Because the staff that they have that are doing things are doing great things. They just need a lot more of them.
I honestly believe it. I mean, you're from the Bronx, a big, huge place. But Spokane's a funny-sized community, and I think everybody in Spokane knows. I mean, we see examples of Gonzaga basketball, you know, just kind of sports analogy type stuff, like Hoop Fest, like Bloomsday. And then you grow up in a town like Spokane, and I grew up at the time of Expo, and you go to the big city, like Seattle, or I went down to California and Long Beach, and you expect to see things even bigger, and you realize, wow, Spokane did amazing stuff, and it was maybe because we were just the right size.
Well, and that's why I have a lot of faith. You asked me, do I think this is solvable? And I think we have a prime opportunity right now. And also, you know, historically, like there's a lot of examples of how Spokane is able to pull together. You know, we're sitting here at the Donut Parade. It's been around for 55 years. Kaiser was booming. This table we're sitting at was probably full of Kaiser workers. So back in the day, okay. But you know, and this little shop almost went out of business one time that I recall, and the neighborhood pulled together to help them stay sustained. That's the thing, is I think this is just one example of how the city of Spokane, we're able to muster the collective will to do things.
And we're a compassionate community. I mean, if we understand, and maybe that's why we're having these conversations, to create that understanding between us and the community, we might be able then, once we we get on the same page. Boy, is it in an area, in a time where there's a lot of bickering going on in the political level. Everybody I hear from on the homelessness situation, this is a completely nonpartisan.
Right. Exactly.
Situation.
Exactly.
Yeah. We can all come together.
And when I talk about policies that have happened in the past and all, you notice I don't name anybody, because doing a post-mortem on who did what with the policies is not what we need. What we need is to look at, okay, where do these things collide? Where does the solution head?
And what are the tools to get out of here?
And the other thing, I think, you're right about Spokane being compassionate. I've got to tell you that I think this is solvable, because Spokane, as on a number of occasions, mustered the collective will to do good. And the other thing is, I really don't think that all the people who live in this community are of the mind that it's appropriate to discard people. I just don't think we're a community that's going to discard people.
I love hearing that. I mean, growing up here, and I think a lot of us that grow up here, we're always kind of looking for outside affirmation of what we think we see. But what I think I see is your guy from the Bronx is saying, that's right. We are a compassionate community that can get stuff done.
Yeah, we can. We can. And I think we should keep our eye out. We're going to see some initiatives where different groups of people who might not always hang out together are going to be working together.
Yeah, sitting in a room, moving from triage to permanent solutions.
Right.
Yeah, I love that.